So I'm just going to get started. I'm Janelle Orsi of Sustainable Economies Law Center, along with my coworker Dorian Payan, who you'll meet in just a moment. And we're putting on this workshop as part of a 4-event series as part of Interdependence Month. And so pretty soon you'll see, I think on our social media, the video of the other 3 events that just happened. But as you'll see in this workshop, a lot of what we're presenting today, even though it's about legal structures and real estate, a lot of it is about interdependence. So excited to be here with y'all. And just to roadmap a little bit of what we're going to do, we have 2 hours. It's kind of a long period, but we know there's a lot of information to cover. What we're going to do, I'm going to give a little bit of context about what prompted this workshop. And then Dorian's going to talk about what is radical real estate, since that's the framing of today. And then we have a lot of information to share. I'm going to talk through legal tools that we can use to create relationships with land, some of the legal limitations that we have to think about, what are some of the legal structures that we could form to hold land, and then what are some of the principles that we can bake into our organizational bylaws and agreements and policies that really help us restore our root relationship with land. And yeah, and then we can discuss. I think I'm hoping we're going to have 30 to 45 minutes for questions and discussion. And just a few other things, we are recording, so say cheese or turn your camera off if you'd prefer to not be in the movie. The slides, again, we are sharing. There's going to be a lot of slides in here that we're not even going to talk about. They're there for informational purposes and reference. And at the very end of the slideshow is links to almost literally probably about 70 other resources that you can then go and check out to build your knowledge. And we're also going to post in the chat, and there's a link to it in the slides, a growing list of who's here as people are filling out that questionnaire. And then finally, a few disclaimers. So we're in California. We're California lawyers, and that's where most of our experience is. And really, laws vary across the country from state to state. So not everything we're going to say here could apply in your situation. And also just situations vary, like the wide variety of real estate projects emerging around the US right now have so many different needs. But that's part of why we're creating this workshop, is a way to give tools to groups to help understand what are all the possibilities. But a lot of what we say here may not apply to you. So just remain open and know there's probably still a lot left to learn. So yeah, those are just some of the disclaimers. And so yeah, Tia from time to time is going to post the link to the slides, to the questionnaire, and to the list of people here in the chat. So thanks, Tia. Okay, so just a little bit of background. We're Sustainable Economies Law Center. If you're in the slides, you can choose your own adventure and click into this other gallery of projects, and it'll show the whole, the spectrum of things that we work on. But real estate has become a really big piece of what we work on. This is our staff, and the folks in green are the ones who work on some facet of real estate, whether it's around housing or farmland or even commercial real estate. So there's a growing number of us really into the real estate space these days. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just rearranging things on my screen to see better. How do I do that? Oh, well, okay. So, and yeah, part of our commitment to doing more real estate work is we started this project called the Radical Real Estate Law School, and we hired 4 amazing activists, one of whom you're about to meet, who are basically growing our capacity to support what feels like an emerging movement around the US to just change our relationship to land. And these are some of the clients that we work with and we meet with on a regular basis, who are, a lot of them are BIPOC-led groups that are getting access to land. And oh, and by the way, what I didn't mention about the Radical Real Estate Law School is these 4 activists are becoming, or 3 of them now, are becoming lawyers without going to law school, which is something you can do in California and a few other states. So training the next generation of radical real estate lawyers. But anyways, yeah, so these are some of our clients. We've learned a lot from them. There's still so much to learn, but we're going to share like some of the wisdom that we've been able to gain so far today. But we also have this thing called the Resilient Communities Legal Cafe. It happens 3 times a month, and it's a kind of a walk-in, or now it's currently a call-in, Zoom-in legal advice clinic. And every month we're getting several groups coming in and talking to us about the real estate projects they're doing and asking questions. And part of the origin of this workshop was realizing it's so hard. It's so hard to roadmap it for groups and say, okay, here's a legal structure you could form, or here's how we'd suggest going about it. And part of that's because the groups are so diverse. But we also realized there's something perhaps inherently confusing in how a lot of this information has been presented in the past. And, sometimes people, they come and they think, okay, there's a list of options. We could be a tenancy in common or a cooperative or a land trust. And a lot of folks come and they do want us to sort of give them some boxes and say, okay, you belong in this box or this box. But we could never really simplify things enough. And we just said, okay, let's step back and understand, why is this so complicated, and how can we give people the tools? And it's very tempting. We've been urged several times to create some kind of matrix, like a decision matrix, where we write out, okay, here's what a community land trust is versus a permanent real estate cooperative. And then, and we've done that. And in fact, you could go here and click and see this one table that we've created. But in retrospect, I look at that and I think what it tries to do is take what is really wildly complex and diverse structures and really confine them and limit them to some kind of definition in a way that's almost unhelpful. So this is my way of saying, like, you're not going to get some nice, neat boxes. Someone also urged us for this workshop to create a decision tree, which is tempting. But again, it's like just arranging boxes into a different shape. And decision trees really cut out a lot of the nuance that we have to be thinking about in these decisions. So maybe that's the bad news, but it's also the good news. There really is no formula. And that, I guess the good news of that is this, like, it's because things are really different and we're really wanting to transform relationships with land. And so the most transformative groups really won't fit into the usual boxes. And yeah, the good news is that means we get to harness the natural intuition, ancestral wisdom, infinite creativity of our communities in crafting something different. And so before we go into that, I'm going to stop sharing and let Dorian share and talk about this question of what is radical real estate? Unless you want me to share, Dorian.
It might be easier. Yeah, it looks like my screen share, my screen sharing has been disabled. I can just let you know when to go through the slides. So you can go to the first one. Hi, everyone. My name is Dorian Fayan. I use he and they pronouns, and as Janelle mentioned, I'm one of the apprentices here at the Radical Real Estate School. I'm going to start talking about what radical real estate is, and so we can just start with the title itself. So real estate's really just a fancy way of saying land or the buildings on top. And well, just by getting to this far, we found our first problem. The main benefit that we get out of calling something real estate is to create a distinction between someone who has it and someone who doesn't. And if you claim to have something, then you can also, next slide, please, Janelle, exclude someone or really anyone else from the land, with some exceptions. Next slide. And you can also get rid of it. We refer to this as the ability to alienate land, meaning it can be sold to someone else. So when you can sell it, essentially what this does is it creates a thing out of land. Next slide now. And land really isn't a thing. If you've ever stood in a meadow or a desert dune or in a forest, you know it's more than just a thing. Next slide. And when we place radical in front of real estate, we want to make the case that it's actually a large and infinite web of relationships that are impossible to put in a box. Next slide. But we're stuck in this place, right, where the idea that land is a thing is still very pervasive. which makes sense. We're immersed in a culture that talks about property as a thing all the time. And the law, whatever that means, is built largely to benefit this idea. Next slide. Another reason we use radical in our wording is to pay attention to the root relationship to land. And these aren't always the relationships that we might personally have to the land that we're on, or that we're in a relationship to. We understand that land has a history, and a lot of the land around us has a violent history in particular. I use carrots here instead of ancient tree roots, because there's some ancient roots that aren't ours to uncover, but a lot of the roots that we do want to get to are the ones that we have to reckon with. After all, roots are made up of the soil, the air, and the water around them. It's almost like roots aren't a thing, they're a relationship too. Next slide. Now, it's important to remember that this violent history largely happened so that this idea of land as a thing could exist. Indigenous people have been dispossessed of most of their land. And even the way that we understand the violence that was placed on Indigenous people is understood through the idea of land as a thing. Think of it. Land can't be taken away from people. You can go on to the next slide. Unless it becomes a thing which you can take away from them. Next slide. And next slide. Even in order to have imagined this dispossession as physically possible, the sheer amount of land that was dispossessed, there must have first been the ability to imagine this potential. Through one, relating to the land as a thing which you could extract resources from, and two, through the use of enslaved labor, which created the initial momentum to create this nation. Next slide. So fast forward to today, and we see effects of land as a thing. The dispossession and enslavement of this country has made it possible for land as a thing to signify wealth. And even at times where there's been pushes to have access for land, for us to participate in this idea of land as a thing and tilt the proportions of who owns it, the results haven't proven great. We don't have to dig too deep to remember broken treaties, redlining, where the federal government made sure that Black communities in particular couldn't access housing or loans. Gentrification, meaning that if land is alienable and a thing to be sold and bought, then those who have money are the ones who get to decide rather than those who are in relationship to land. And speculation, part of what drives gentrification. Speculation is mostly the very unhealthy obsession of land as a thing that supports a vicious and unending pattern of real estate. White supremacy, extraction, greed, and the culture of dominance, they all hinge on possession. But back to the piece where we get to our roots and come to understand land as a web of relationship. Next slide. Several communities, despite not being able to have access to land, have continued to build. In one precarious way or another, they have found their ways to relating with the land. In the words of Fred Moten, everything I love survives dispossession, which means that despite great efforts of being severed from the land, they've still found a way to be in that web of relationships. But relating to the land in a system that allows you to be excluded is not nearly enough, and not something that is easy to even come by. So many of us still don't have access to land. So we want to take this love, exemplified strongest in BIPOC communities and in non-human communities, and support a whole movement around it. And in fact, it's a movement that's already underway. Next slide, please. Some of our clients who are also our teachers are largely aware of themselves being nested in a web of relationships. We have Shelterwood, a queer and trans BIPOC-led movement coming to relationship with forests to repair the harm of years of mismanagement, all while offering a place to heal. We have the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, for example, who's not only looking to house people, they're housing a full movement, transforming the idea of ownership altogether in Oakland. And we also have Segura Te, whose lands we dwell on, the Ohlone. They are teaching us what it means to sustain an ancient relationship to land. And in the midst of encroachment of development, are carrying the very important work of rematriation forward. Next slide. There's a bit of humor in placing the word radical next to a colonial concept like real estate. It doesn't entirely make sense, but there's a tangled legal world that we still have to navigate in order to come to be in those relations. And we have to move through these awkward legal structures to get to a place where we can see land as a relation. Yet it doesn't have to be an entirely miserable process, or one that at the end of the day keeps the idea of that land isn't thing entirely. What we're ultimately trying to do here is secure those webs of relationships. And this is why we're here today during the Law Center's Interdependence Month. It's what radical real estate is for us. I'll pass it back to Janelle now, who will carry us through the rest of this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorian. My thing about this presentation is seeing what pictures you draw. I love the Extractor 3000, by the way. Anyway, so I'm just going to go just a little bit deeper to share what is really shaping the format and the content of this presentation, because we're talking about land as really a web of relationships, but I wanted to look closely at like what's in these relationships. And I know it's weird to come to a legal workshop and hear people talk a lot about love, but really like that's to me what it comes down to. And just to say a little bit more, about what I mean when I say that word, is that our relationship to land and housing is one of give and take. It's one of reciprocity, where and when we say land, I'm also talking about housing, even commercial real estate. Picture any kind of real estate. It's something that, well, first of all, provides for us. It provides a shelter, space, livelihood, food, water. But it's also something that we provide for. We take care of it. We steward it. And so this give and take relationship, it's very similar to how we relate to our families, our kin. And so protecting that relationship and the pieces of it, the give and take of it, you can begin to see how like contracts and bylaws then become sort of harder structures that help protect that kind of give and take relationship. And by the way, Sean, your camera went off. I don't know if that's a problem on your end, but in case you missed it.
No, we switched interpreters.
Oh, okay. Great.
Carol Day is the other interpreter.
Thanks, Carol and Sean, for being here. I don't know if we need to change who we're spotlighting or pinning. There we go. All right. So yeah, just digging in a little bit more is every place, every home, piece of land has many relationships. Our tendency in this legal system is to have like one person on the deed and they have the primary relationship. But the reality is, whether the legal system recognizes it or not, there's many relationships with each piece of land. So in this workshop, one of the first things we're going to do is talk about the legal tools that protect those relationships. And that's words like easement, lease, and license and deeds. We'll talk about those in a minute. But each of these relationships kind of links to another web of relationships. So let's imagine a cooperative owns land. Then all of the relationships in and among around that cooperative will really matter and have an impact on land and land relations. So we're creating webs of webs. And yeah, the second part of the workshop is going to really look in at the organizations, the structures, what do we put in the bylaws? Also, what entities do we choose? So that's kind of the rough order of talking about the legal tools, then the organizational structures. And from that is going to emerge 3 key principles that we're putting forward. And all of these things are emergent, but these are 3 themes that have come out over and over again for us as being really important to prioritize. And they take different shapes, but the core is, if people want to steward land, take care of land, they need to have power and agency over it. And so we need organizations and structures that spread power to every person. And if people are going to be provided for by land, we need structures that ensure that the wealth of the relationships with land spread to many people. And so if we're spreading power and spreading wealth, we also need to protect that wealth and power, make sure it stays rooted in the community in the long term. And it means protecting, creating solid legal structures that protect these relationships against what would be threats from greed, extraction, dominance culture, white supremacy. So the 3 principles, that's what we're going to talk about at the end. So we're building a web of webs. But we're starting from this other place, which is a box of boxes where people are things that can own land on these deeds, and that land is this thing that can be transferred around like a box. And so it's an awkward place to start when you're building a web of webs, but we're finding our way. So let's start with the legal tools. Deeds. I think I like to make fun of deeds because they're these official looking documents with, it's squares with more squares on it. And the more squares there are, the more official it looks. But this is the invention, fabricated tool that our legal system has created to grant dominion over a piece of land. And it's kind of annoying, but this is how pretty much all land is held in the United States. And so it's what we're starting from. Almost all land has a deed that indicates who has dominion over it. And so, but then there are a lot of things we can layer on top of that deed that create other relationships. I mean, one of those things is actually just putting multiple parties on a deed. And generally, when you have two or more people or entities on a deed, then that creates what's called tenancy in common, or you may have heard of TIC. And so sometimes people buy a home together, they're both on the deed. They will then further define their relationship to the land through what's called a TIC agreement, tenancy in common agreement, or you could just call it a co-ownership agreement. Without such an agreement, there's a default assumption that everything is shared and that any party can force a sale at any time, which, by the way, is how a lot of Black land has been lost in the South. As people inherit property, they become co-owners of it with relatives. And if any one owner transfers their share or wants to sell the property, that's how a lot of things just end up on auction and land gets lost. But that's kind of a side note, but co-ownership is a powerful tool for creating more land relationships. Another tool is to split the title, which means that one party might own the land, let's say it's a land trust, and another party owns the building, it could be the family that lives in the building. And what's powerful about doing that is it gives the people in the building a sense of ownership and autonomy in how they maintain the house and who lives there. But through what's called a ground lease, the land trust is giving a long-term lease of the land to the people who live in the building. And in that lease, it will often say something like, if you sell the building, you have to sell it at an affordable rate. You can't just go sell it on the speculative market. And so this form of splitting title is how a lot of land trusts, specifically community land trusts that tend to focus on preservation of affordable housing, that's the way that they often preserve affordability. So another category of tools, I've just broadly call them purchase rights or purchase options. Basically, it's any kind of an agreement that says to another party, you can buy this land later. And then the timing of when that happens or who triggers it happening or the price, there's a lot of different ways you can shape that. But generally a purchase option means, like if I give someone a purchase option, it means that at any point they could say, oh, I'm ready to buy your property now. And usually there's a predetermined price. Sometimes it's just at quote unquote fair market value. But yeah, there's also right of first refusal when the owner decides they want to sell, right of first offer, which at least gives another party the ability to be the first to come and negotiate. And so these are not used a whole lot, but I think they could be used a whole lot more, because if we sort of look around at the land in our cities now and say, in the long term, we want this to be in the commons, we could start negotiating with property owners now to say, will you give a purchase option or a right of first refusal to a land trust so that down the road, this property won't just go into the speculative market. So, I picture, creating land banks of sorts that could hold hundreds or thousands of purchase options or rights of first refusal on behalf of land trusts. So there's these slides that have the little red earmark in the top left corner. Those are slides I'm going to skip, but since you have access to the slides, you can come back later. You can click on things and read them. So I'm just going to ski right over them. So there's three kinds of ways to create other, possession of land, use of land. And I'm going to talk about each one: license, lease, easement. So just the basic gist of them is a license tends to say, hey, you can come onto the land and use it and do things on it. Like when you stay at a hotel, you have a license to stay in a hotel room. It's not a lease. It's not a situation where you could stay there over a long period of time or have exclusive use of a particular space for that time. Yeah, so licenses, they're lighter. They're not great for creating long-term land relationships, but you can create them to do so. Actually, I'm going to just go to the next slide. Yeah, so I talked about licenses. Also, yeah, if neighbors take down fences to share yards, they're effectively giving each other license to use each other's yards. But yeah, leases then are something that are intended to be more solid and create longer term relationships, like even up to 99-year relationships. Some states limit how long a lease can last. But yeah, there's a lot of room for creativity, but one thing you do need to know is that leases tend to be governed by landlord-tenant law, and that can put some limitations on what you can include in them, or put some requirements like bedbug disclosures or whatever. And then easements. So compared to licenses and leases, easements are a very powerful tool. And I like to say that they can ease the artificial boundaries of private property and secure a web of relationships around that property. And that's if we start to get creative in how we use easements. And so an easement is, how to define an easement. One thing to know about easements is they generally run with the land. They're intended to be a permanent right. So unlike licenses, which are temporary, leases, which are maybe long-term, but still not perpetual, easements are often intended to just always be attached to the land. And so we've been thinking about what are some creative ways to use easements to permanently protect land. And so if you're in here, you can click on this thing where we wrote called a kinship conservation easement. It's really a draft, an experimental document, but we're looking at like, what if we grant a tribe an easement that helps that tribe create a more permanent relationship to land and relate to it in a way that's much more like kinship. So you can check that out. And it's building on an existing tool called conservation easements. Conservation easements generally, there's one person maybe who owns the land, but then a land trust owns a conservation easement, and it gives that land trust the ability to prevent the land from being destroyed, developed, et cetera. And so we're sort of taking the model of conservation easement and thinking about how can we apply it to protect other things that are important, like a relationship of kinship to land. And we've also experimented with something called a housing justice easement, and we've written an article about it. But this would be a permanent restriction on the price that could be charged for a piece of property, or the rent that could be charged. And so imagine there's a homeowner and they grant a housing justice easement to a community land trust. Then when the homeowner wants to go sell their home, there's going to be a cap on how much they could sell it for, or there might even be a requirement that they sell it only to a low income or low to moderate income household. So all of this is to say, we're hoping to be, sorry, dog noises in the background. We're hoping to be exploring easements more in coming years as a way to create more permanent and different land relationships. So I'm just going to skip the slide on housing justice easements. Yeah, a couple other tools. One is estate planning, which everything I've talked about so far has been what feels like tools for creating solid relationships with land. Estate planning tends to be a one-sided thing. It's one person who might write into their will or trust, I want to give my house to this land trust. And the problem with that is that before they die, they can revoke it. So I do encourage people to use estate planning to put their real estate on a path back to the commons, but it's not as solid as some of these other tools are, like a purchase option or an easement. So there are, however, sometimes irrevocable trusts that you put your home in a trust and it says that after you die, it's going to go to a certain organization. Those as the name may imply, are irrevocable. So that is a more solid way to put land on a path back to the commons. And I just realized I should clarify the use of the word trust, because there's different ways that it shows up. Land trusts tend to be 501c3 nonprofit organizations that hold and protect land. There's also this thing called a trust that a lot of people use in estate planning, especially, where it's basically a tool to avoid probate in most cases. But it puts property in the hands or management of a trustee and helps ensure that after a person dies, that it transfers to the right beneficiaries. So yeah, there's differences in how we use the word trust. I just wanted to note that. And one other thing I'll mention is life estates. This is not used very much, but the basic gist of it is that you could write into a deed something to the effect of, I give this house to such and such land trust while I can stay there for the rest of my life. And so it's splitting up the land into two parts. There's the period of time in which I live on the land, and then when I die, and then it becomes full ownership. It goes into full ownership by the trust. So yeah, so those are the tools. And this is almost a real scenario here. You can imagine a piece of land that has many tools in use to create and protect a lot of different relationships, because you could picture a larger piece of land that has a lot of people living on it. Well, those folks probably have leases. There may be a lot of other people who visit the land or have a relationship with it, who have licenses to come access it and visit. There's also others who have relationships with the land ancestors, animals, plants, and that even though they may not be able to have a direct legal relationship with the land, a nonprofit organization like a tribal nonprofit could hold an easement that gives that nonprofit the ability to enforce certain rights to protect those other stakeholders. And of course, if there's one person on the deed, but an intention that maybe it be later owned by a land trust, then that land trust could have a right to purchase it later on for $1. There could also be a split title situation where someone who's living in a home actually owns the building, but they don't own the land underneath. So you could see you can get creative and build a lot of relationships using these tools. And one thing to note is that in a way, you should look at the land and the house and just say, what relationships do we want here? And then answer the question of what tools you should use rather than the other way around, if that makes sense. So also, that was, this image is one of just imagining a lot of relationships around one piece of land. Another thing you can imagine is an organization or a particular city building up a web of relationships. And so EBPREC stands for East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and it has relationships with a lot of other local organizations. And so as it's beginning to acquire and hold title to property, it's building relationships with those other organizations that might use the property or be in a position to receive it later on, like if the cooperative ever dissolves. And so it's really strengthening the protection all around the land and ensuring that there's broader benefit beyond just whoever's on the deed. Okay, gonna take a sip of water. Okay. Okay. All right, so I've just described a lot of tools, but unfortunately then sometimes law gets in the way or other kinds of legal relationships get in the way. And it's frustrating. So I just want to put you on notice of what those are. One of those is that institutional lenders, they don't like this web of webs. They really want land to just sort of fit into a nice tidy box so that if at any point you don't make payments on your loans, they can just box up that land and sell it on auction. And so they don't want to see long-term leases or conservation easements or purchase options. They're not going to like any of that. And, the solution is we need to start finding other sources of finance, put pressure on lenders to change their policies. But in the meantime, if a property is subject to a mortgage, it does put a lot of limitations on what you can do with it. I'm going to skip some slides, but you can come back and learn a little bit more about the kinds of clauses that are in the mortgage documents and some ideas about how to navigate it. Okay, so after lenders, also landlord-tenant law can limit us. And landlord-tenant law is really written for what is in fact a kind of an adversarial and often exploitative relationship. So we're really glad we have landlord-tenant laws, particularly in the sense that they protect tenants. But the same laws can sometimes be limiting of the kinds of relationships we want to create. And sometimes that could be, an example might be habitability standards. If people want to live in a cob building or a tiny home that they built themselves, but they don't own the land, then still the landlord or whoever owns the land is going to have a legal requirement to provide a habitable space for the tenant. So, it basically, it does take away people's autonomy in how they want to live. So something to just learn and navigate. Homeowners association rules can sometimes come up and limit what we can do with land. If you want someone to be able to park an RV in your driveway and live there for a little bit, I'm going to guess a lot of homeowners association rules will say no to that, as will a lot of local zoning rules. And so I learned that about 40% of homes in California are subject to homeowners association rules. And so it does come up a lot. Property insurers can sometimes limit what people want to do on land or the relationships you create with it. And so it doesn't come up a whole lot in our experience, but still, whatever you're doing with the land, you want to make sure that either that insurance covers it or you're thinking along with other people, okay, we're taking some risks here. How do we want to share this risk? I would say never let fear of liability hold you back too much from what you want to do, because it is one of the things that I see holding up a lot of projects is just this fear of, oh, we're going to get sued. Skip that. Property tax considerations can sometimes limit what we want to do. This is especially true in California. It's not actually true in as many other states, but anytime ownership changes in California, the tax assessor comes and reassesses the property. And so if the value has gone up a lot, it means property taxes are going to shoot up. This comes up a lot in our work, where maybe, let's say, an owner wants to give someone a long-term lease or create a co-ownership arrangement or just transfer it to a land trust or a real estate cooperative. If the property taxes are going to go from, they can go from $1,000 a year and shoot up to $30,000 a year, it's going to hold people back from creating these relationships. And so by the way, this change in ownership, it's a pretty broadly defined thing that includes things like long-term leases. So it does hold back some of the land relationships we want to form. Okay, property taxes, income taxes. I would say the main consideration is if you're entering into a relationship with a piece of land, you might want to ask, okay, is this taxable income to me? The way it tends to come up is if you're receiving land or housing in exchange for your labor. You go and work on a farm and, there's employment law issues here, by the way. I'm not even going to address that. But let's say you go and work on a farm and in exchange, you get housing. What the IRS would say is that you need to pay taxes on the value of the housing you're receiving because it's compensation for labor. So these things come up. But land that's given to you as a gift or housing that's really given to you as a gift out of generosity without the expectation of something in return, that doesn't tend to be taxable income. And so there's a lot of little things to think about with regard to tax. There's also, for property owners that might want to sell at a discount or even donate land, there's tax benefits that they can access, and a lot of different rules around how you can access those tax benefits. Just a little more on that in the slides. Okay, one of my least favorite laws, this is just embedded in our legal system, is this concept that property is a thing that should be alienable. You should be able to just market it and sell it and transfer it freely. And the problem is we're trying to kind of do the opposite. We want to permanently protect land from the speculative market. And so, so that basically the law says that if, like, let's say you want to give a land trust a purchase option that they can have for 99 years, for example. So anytime in the next 99 years, this land trust can come and buy this land. Courts might say that's an unreasonable restraint on alienation because it's preventing the current owner from just selling to whoever they want to anytime they want. So the thing that we've learned about this is that we can put restraints on land as long as there's a really good justification for doing so, like a public purpose that we serve, creating affordable housing, protecting ecosystems. And so if we want to basically prevent land from being sold again on the speculative market, we also need to have a clear statement of why we're doing that. And a lot of times courts will be like, okay, that's reasonable. You're trying to protect affordable housing. We can see why you don't want to just sell the land to anyone. So I have several slides about how this law annoys me. I'm going to skip those. Okay, rule against perpetuities. It's kind of similar. It's a rule that is designed to prevent us from putting really long-term restrictions on land. And it's a rule that was really, it's designed to prevent dead people from just dictating what happens to the land after they're dead. So just know that this exists, and that if you're planning to put some long-term restraints on what can happen with land, that you want to just check and see if it violates this thing called the rule against perpetuities. I cannot tell you what the rule is because it is the hardest thing to memorize when you're studying for the bar exam. It is literally the hardest rule to memorize. So I have forgotten it. So know it's there. A couple other legal things that come up, whether or not something can run with the land. So let's say that we put, we have a cultural easement on a piece of land, and it gives a local tribe permanent access to come onto the land and use it for ceremony. Then a question is, will that right transfer even if the ownership of the land transfers? So that's called running with the land, and certain kinds of covenants or easements, they do run with the land, but others not. And so I'm not going to go into all the rules about which ones do, but I will just share some of the creative things that we're wanting to do with easements, like use them to protect long-term affordability of housing. It may not run with the land, so it doesn't make it a strong tool yet, although I will say there's a national group trying to figure out how we can strengthen these and enable them to run with the land. Okay, so land use and zoning laws can sometimes limit what we do on land. Like if you wanted to, here's this example again, let someone use your driveway to live in a RV. A lot of times zoning laws will say, no, you can't do that. If you want to let people come and host regular gathering events at your home, you have to just check and see, does the zoning of your property allow you to have those kinds of events? So zoning laws are always a thorn in my side, and they are, I will say, for a lot of our clients, it's a challenge. Just living in community. One of our clients is a village, people living together as a village, but the local zoning laws say, no, this is like single family housing. You can't have this many people living together. It's a historic tribal village site. So even though historically people have lived there as a village, the zoning says, no, this is for this, white dominant culture notion of a nuclear family and their single family home. So yes, this is why we say land use laws are deepening white supremacy. So you can come back and read more about that. And then lastly, anti-discrimination laws, which are really, really important. They do, however, sometimes get in the way of things we want to do to repair the harms of discrimination. So if you, for example, want to create, housing for, let's say in Oakland, where such a substantial portion of the Black community has been displaced, if you want to create housing that's targeted to the Black community, you can't do that because of fair housing laws. And yeah, the same is true even in finance. Like we were talking recently to a fund that's wanting to really put, focus fund or financing on Black land projects, and they're also worried about discrimination laws. And so a lot of our clients do come up against this when they're really trying to engage in a project driven by reparations. So I'm about to switch gears and start talking about organizations. And because we've spent time talking about all these different kinds of relationships you can form directly with land, but then oftentimes the land is going to be owned by an organization. And then the big question is, well, what structure do we form and how do we operate? So I'm going to switch gears to that and take a sip of water. Whew, okay, I'm aware of being a little bit unfocused today, but trying to get back in the zone. And also, here comes some law stuff that is often very dry. So we like to explain it using cake and make it a little less painful. So here we go. Cake. Here's why we're using cake. Because a lot of times, we have clients come to us and they say, oh, what kind of organization should we form? Should we form a B Corp, or should we form a nonprofit or a S Corp? And what they're really saying is mushing together different things, like the entity you form at the state level, the tax status you choose at the federal level. And so I think it's really important to parse these things out. So with the cake itself, so imagine the spongy part. That's, the part that you bake. That's the entity that you form at the state level. It could be like a corporation, a cooperative corporation, et cetera. And then layered on top of that is the icing, which is the tax status, which is a choice you make at the federal level. And the reason why we parse these things out is you can mix and match a lot. And so there's flexibility there. But honestly, people tend to put too much importance on the cake and the icing, when really what matters is the ingredients. And the ingredients it's the policies, it's the governance, the financial provisions, it's the culture. It's the thing that really gives the cake its flavor. And so if you hear phrases like community land trust or permanent real estate cooperative, those are not kinds of entities or special tax categories. Those are really comprised of choices that you make and how you structure the organization, you structure governance. Mostly those are not legally defined terms. They're sort of culturally, they've sort of been created in the vernacular of our movements as kinds of, or ways that certain kinds of organizations take shape. So, okay, a little bit more just on the cake. Again, state level, you form your entity usually by filing something with the Secretary of State. At the federal level, you choose the tax status. And there's generally three major categories of cake. Public benefit, like nonprofit public benefit corporations, they're these kind of outward oriented cakes. They're designed to benefit the public, compared to mutual benefit organizations that are generally about a group of people benefiting themselves, like a cooperative. And then there's this whole other category that is generally used for profit enterprises or for shareholder benefit, which includes LLCs and stock corporations, et cetera. And if you're a radical real estate project, honestly, none of these cakes are going to feel quite right, because that's part of what's special here is we defy classification within the dominant structures. And we don't tend to bifurcate our ways of thinking into benefiting the public versus benefiting ourselves. It's a lot more natural to kind of do all at the same time. But, our legal system likes to put things in boxes. So here we are. So we need to choose a cake, but there's still a lot of flexibility in what we bake into the cake. So the choice of cake doesn't matter a whole lot, except for, I will say, whether you decide to be a nonprofit or not is one of the key considerations that I'm going to talk about. So our sweet spot, as far as what do the groups that we work with tend to form, they tend to either be 501c3 nonprofits that bake in a lot of cooperative ingredients. That's where you can see the swirls in the cake. They've sort of baked in some democratic governance and self-determination. Or they're cooperative entities that bake in a lot of public benefit, change-oriented work. And they do that with the ingredients that they bake in. And these other entities that are normally oriented for shareholder benefit, you can still bake in public and mutual benefit ingredients, and that can be very meaningful and powerful. So again, like the choice of cake doesn't matter as much as the ingredients. Then the icing on top, like I said, you can kind of mix and match, but generally, and I'm not going to go into detail on each of these, there's certain types of tax categories that tend to go with certain cakes. Like they're good, particularly good pairings. And I'm only going to talk about a couple, really one of them in great detail, which is 501c3. So yeah, and my main thought again is just that, we don't have to go overboard obsessing about what tax category to choose, because the choice of tax category can come with some limitations on what your activities are, where your income comes from, expenses go to. And sometimes what we see is organizations kind of contort themselves just to get a certain kind of tax exemption, when the reality is paying taxes, in the end, the amount of taxes organizations would have to pay is often fairly minimal if you're not generating a big surplus income. So sometimes it's worth just being a taxed entity. So I'm going to just talk about a few different of the 501Cs that come up the most for us. And this big question of should you be a public benefit nonprofit or not is, I would say, the pivotal choice that a lot of our clients make. And that's the nonprofit. It can become a 501c3. And so for 501c3, I put sprinkles on the cake because this is the one 501c category that has this special status of being able to take tax deductible donations. So an individual donates money, they can deduct the amount of that donation from their income for tax purposes. Also, this is what helps a lot of 501c3s get grants. But for things that don't really fit into 501c3, there's also 501c4, which is called a social welfare organization. It doesn't have the ability to take tax deductible donations, but it still has the main benefit of being not taxed on its net income. And it can have much broader purposes than a 501c3 can. And then of course you can also form nonprofit corporations and not get tax exemption, which means you don't have to do all of the, you don't have to confine your activities to the, say, charitable or educational activities. And you don't have to do the very extensive annual transparent 990 reporting that nonprofits do. You just pay tax like a normal corporation would, and that might not be a bad thing if you don't have a lot of taxable income. So, okay, so let's just look at 501c3s a little more closely because it's a powerful tool. A lot of people shy away from them because they're like, 501c3s, it's the nonprofit industrial complex. I want nothing to do with that. But there's a lot of benefits. So let's talk about that. And, not all radical real estate projects will fit in a 501c3, but sometimes it's worth seeing if you can because of the benefits that come with it. So the two well-known benefits are you don't pay taxes on your net income, and it is easier to get donations and grants. Other entities can get donations and grants too, but it's 501c3s that tend to get the largest share of those. But the four benefits that people don't think about as much, one is property tax exemption, which in California, where property values are so high, property taxes, at least on one property that with a client we're working with, property taxes is like the majority of the rent that people are paying every month is going to property taxes, the majority of the rent they're paying. So if we could reduce or remove property taxes, it would create much more affordable housing in that situation. So property tax exemption is a whole other process, and not every nonprofit can get it. It really depends on how you're using the land, and certain types of activities will disqualify a nonprofit from getting it, but I won't go into all the details, but just know You generally have to be a 501c3 in order to get it, at least in California. So that's a major benefit. Another major benefit people don't think about is if people are going to volunteer for the project or organization, it's a lot safer to be a 501c3 because as a general rule, people can freely volunteer for charitable organizations. But for things that are for-profit entities or even cooperatives, you got to be careful about using unpaid labor. There's ways to do it that we're not going to go into, but it is safer if you're a 501c3. This one is a big consideration for some folks I know, such as myself, is if you have a lot of student loan debt, working for a 501c3 can give you access to loan forgiveness. And sometimes this is like, that's a big decider as far as who we work for or what entities we choose. And then in general, 501c3s just get a lot of special treatment under the law. They tend to be exempt from a lot of fees, exempt from jumping through a lot of regulatory hoops. And so depending on what you're doing with the land or any enterprise on it, being a 501c3 could really smooth the path through a lot of regulatory barriers. And just to clear up a few misconceptions about 501c3s, you can earn income. There's a lot of income generating activities that if they're really designed to advance your charitable or educational workshops, then the income you bring in is fine. You can be democratic. A lot of times people assume that nonprofits have to have an executive director and be hierarchical, but at Sustainable Economies Law Center, we're trying to really put out a lot of different models for how nonprofits could have more participatory democratic governance. You can do policy advocacy. You do need to keep it, you do need to contain it. You can't do electoral advocacy, and you can do lobbying to influence legislation, but you do need to keep it to be a somewhat smaller portion of what you do. But the point is you can do a good amount. Oh, and you can get paid. Sometimes people have a mistaken assumption that if you form a nonprofit, you can't pay yourself, but nonprofits can provide people with reasonable compensation for their labor or other contributions. So I've given you a lot of reasons why being a 501c3 is beneficial, but then there still is this question of whether a radical real estate project can be a 501c3. And at the Law Center, we're in the position of working with a lot of groups that they're not your grandmother's charity. They're not what would conventionally be thought of as charitable organizations, because it's communities coming together to provide for themselves in very, very cooperative ways. And so what we've been learning, though, is that a lot of these can either be 501c3s or get funding from 501c3s. And part of the reason for that is that the boundaries of 501c3 law have moved and expanded over time as we come to understand what are the problems that our society and our world are facing. And so there's a whole lot of slides after this that I'm not going to talk through, but you can come back and I'm going to add a video that talks through them, only because we realize it's almost like too much information for this one workshop. But the short story is that over time, the IRS has really expanded what it views as a charitable activity. In the 60s, the IRS was looking at land conservation efforts and being like, well, we don't see what's charitable about that. And then eventually came around and realized, oh, okay, so there's threats to land, and it's beneficial to society if we protect it. So, okay, we'll treat land conservation as a charitable activity. And it wasn't until I think the 70s that agricultural land conservation came to be viewed as a charitable activity. And so it really has to do with what are the problems that we're seeing as a society and what are the solutions that we're bringing forward. And there's a lot of really innovative things that people are doing with land to alleviate the threats that we're facing as a society. So arguably, it creates space for a lot of different land-related projects to be 501c3s. So that was a very short overview of a much more complicated story that I'm not going to tell today. I did put a slide in here where you can come back and you can click on this 1 hour-long workshop where I do go into much more detail on what can or can't be a 501c3. And I was thinking I'm going to record a short video and come back and link it here of all this material that I'm now skipping over. Okay, but one more thing about 501c3s is, okay, yes. Sometimes what we do with clients is they are 501c3s, but then we form another entity that will be a 501c2, and that entity holds the land. And the reason we do that is that 501c2s have somewhat broader or allow for broader purposes or broader land uses than 501c3s do. So let's say a 501c3 purchases farmland and they want to be able to lease part of it to just a regular for-profit farm. And it's possible the IRS, if they were just a 501c3, would say, hey, that's just a commercial activity. That's not a charitable activity. But by owning it in a 501c2, they could, in fact, lease to a regular commercial farm without having it threaten their tax exempt status as a 501c3. So that's the short of it on 501c2s. And you can come back and see this chart that sort of compares them and what the different roles of the organizations are. So I talked a lot about nonprofits. Then if you decide you're not going to go the 501c3 nonprofit route, then really there's kind of an open space for what you might do. And again, I just want to say, don't overthink it. But the benefit of being these other entities as compared to a nonprofit is all these other entities generally can just operate for any legal purpose, whereas the nonprofits tend to be constrained to what is often framed as a public purpose. So yeah, broader activities. These other entities allow for more self-help and self-determination, groups of people organizing for their own benefit, which can be sort of an awkward thing to do within a 501c3 because they're supposed to be about public and charitable benefit, not about private parties benefiting themselves. So these other entities open up those possibilities. Even if you're not a nonprofit, you can still receive donations. And I always really try to emphasize that because people sometimes think, oh, well, we want to be a cooperative, but we also want donations. You can totally have donations. It's just that some of those donations might be treated as income that's taxable and the donor can't take the tax deduction. But the reality is most people in the US right now can't take charitable donations. They just take the standard deduction on their taxes. We're talking about like 90% or more of people. So yeah, any entity really can receive donations. Being something other than a nonprofit like a cooperative or an LLC, it does open doors to being able to raise capital in different forms. Like nonprofits really can just take loans, but let's say you're a cooperative, you could sell shares and take member capital contributions, and that money becomes equity on your books, and that might help you leverage institutional loans. And so depending on how you're going to finance the project, this could impact your choice of entity. Other entities can influence politics galore. And of course, there's a lot that needs to change in this world. And so being an entity that can influence it it's an important and powerful thing. And where did this slide come from? Yeah, I guess the thing I was trying to say in this slide, this is what happens when you have too many slides. Yeah, just that there's a lot of room for creativity in your structure. Yeah. Oh, by the way, this word cooperative, I just want to acknowledge that it means a lot of things depending on who's saying it and in what context. Cooperatives are a tax category, they're a type of entity. They're also just kind of a state of mind, you know, a way of being in an organization. So what I want to say though is that there are in most states entities you could form, you know, cakes you can bake that are called cooperatives or cooperative corporations. I'll just share in California, the benefits to doing it, to being a cooperative corporation is you can call yourself a cooperative. Only if you're a cooperative corporation in general can you call yourself a cooperative, which for a lot of groups is important because cooperative sounds super awesome. Another thing about cooperative corporations is that they have a built-in democratic structure. It's legally required that you have one vote per member. There's also legally mandated due process. So if you really want to bake the democratic structure into your cake, actually it kind of comes pre-baked under the law. Under California law, there's also a 15% cap on what any person can receive annually as a return on investment. So built into the legal structure of cooperative corporations is non-extractive finances. It's not a vehicle people can use to maximize profits. And lastly, in California, this was a big one for us. For example, in our choice to form East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative as a cooperative corporation, is that you can sell shares to members of the cooperative for up to $1,000 per person without having to jump through a lot of legal hoops. Generally, if you want to sell shares of a company to the public, you have to do a lot of work to get approval from regulators, to provide disclosures. But cooperative corporations in California can sell shares for up to $1,000 per person. And that's powerful because that could be a down payment. That gives the community a lot more control over being able to finance its own projects. So in the roughly, how much more time do I want to talk? 20 more minutes. I'm going to just share that after everything I've said about cakes and icing, it's really the ingredients that matter. And there's no, like, these are the things that you can really decide for yourselves based on who are you? What's your goal? Where are you? Who's involved? And I mentioned these 3 principles earlier on as things that you can, these really take shape in the ingredients of the organization, which is spreading power, spreading wealth, and then keeping that wealth and power rooted in community or protecting it against commodification. And you can fold these ingredients into a lot of places. Bylaws are a very powerful place to fold them in because that's it's a legally binding document, kind of a little like a constitution. But you can also bake it into the policies, procedures, culture, like anything, any of the agreements. These are just all kind of patterns and principles you can keep in mind as you're designing all of this. And some of the slides below, I'm going to not dwell on them very long, but you can come back and many of them are written to actually be used if you want to. Like you can take these slides and plop them down into your own organization, adapt them to your own purposes. If you feel like, okay, this is a policy or a practice we want to adopt. And by the way, we love slideshows. I love slideshows. And you can click here to see an example of slideshow bylaws that we've created. One nice thing about slides is they're modular. You can take them and, drop them into other places and use them. So in the spirit of overkill, I have like 22 practices and tools to spread power. And I guess Dorian and I were talking, what was the word? Rhythms. Dorian was also sort of talking about rhythms. I use the word patterns a lot. These are just sort of things that we see across a lot of organizations where, if we think that organization is doing a really great job of engaging the community and participatorily shaping the work, what are some of the patterns? What are some of the rhythms that we see as common across these organizations? And so here's 22 of them. Again, I'm not going to land on all of them, but just, the thing about power, by the way, is, just when you ask yourself these big questions, like what is power? You realize power just sort of is. It's part of being. It's part of existing, is that we naturally move and make things happen. And we're driven as living beings to let our lives thrive and support the thriving of other life. This is us acting in the world. That's power. And in many ways, a lot of the practices that follow are about removing the blockages to power. It's about freeing us from the oppressive structures that block our ability to act and have agency. Including just like naming and, constantly naming and working against the concentration or stagnation of power, and particularly talking about systems of dominance and oppression and how they show up and create the concentration of power in the hands of particular people. So I put these two up front and mention them because they are just so important. But I'm going to just click through the slides very briefly to say, you know, there's just a lot of ways to organize where things happen in an organization, who's doing them, to ensure that people have really robust participation. And some of these include like how are decisions and proposals made, who has the power, how do people communicate, what do meetings feel like, how are meetings created and facilitated, how does an actual decision get deliberated upon, what's the criteria for deciding something. Conflict is a big one, by the way. All the time, all day long, it feels like conflict is shaping our organizations and what we do, which is a beautiful thing. You think of conflict as something you want to just kind of shy away from, but honestly, it's the thing that kind of pushes us against our edges and forces us to continually do things better and better. And honestly, what we look at with so many of our clients is that conflict does, come and sometimes really threaten the organization. But the more we really commit resources to having, alternative dispute resolution and spaces where we can come together and hold people with compassion and work to acknowledge and repair harm, that's so important to the resilience of our organizations. Just sliding through these additional slides here. Power and knowledge come hand in hand. So spreading skills, the actual work that gets done and the power tend to come hand in hand. So spreading and sharing work and responsibilities. I'll just share a lot of radical real estate projects that we see involve a lot of different people. And those different people have different kinds of relationship to the land. They might be residents, other people are guests, other people are employed to help steward the land. And so a lot of what I imagine groups will do is create multi-stakeholder organizations, like it could be cooperatives with different kinds of members or owners. And so I just give this as an example of the different kinds of members that could, that might be kind of baked into the bylaws of a cooperative in a land project. And some member groups will be larger than others, some will be overlapping. And some kinds of members or stakeholders will be the primary focus or priority of an organization, while others might be less so. But the idea is like when you take a stakeholder group and give them the rights of membership or ownership in an organization, you're giving them a voice and ensuring that at least some of the benefits of the organization flow to them. But you can really kind of calibrate who has the power and how the benefits flow. So there's a lot of customization. The bylaws of East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative are an example of a multi-stakeholder cooperative, and you can see there's different categories of people with different relationships to the cooperative. Representing other stakeholders, the plants and the animals and the ancestors can't necessarily be members of a cooperative, but you could have, say, board seats that are appointed or elected to represent those interests. And board of directors, this is a requirement of almost every corporate entity in the US, your nonprofit, cooperative. A lot of times you have to have a board of directors, which is to me a little bit of an archaic structure. But since we have to have them, the main thing I like to say is that the role of the board should not be to hold power in many cases, because what we're trying to do is spread power. The role of the board should be to spread power so that as many people as possible have agency and the ability to apply their affection to land and shape their relationships with it. So, okay, so that was practices, patterns, rhythms for spreading power. Let's just talk about spreading wealth briefly. And again, it's like, what is wealth? It's fun to ask these big questions because it is very easy to picture a big pile of money as wealth. I think it's what a lot of us picture. But then I was like, what is it though? Wealth in the word origin is about wellness, well-being, and nourishment, which in that sense, money being this scarce thing that many of us don't have a lot of access to, It's a very limiting concept of wealth. Wealth is infinite. It's really about how we exist in relationship to each other and take care of each other. And it's how the nourishment flows. And again, like a lot of what we need to do is to just free ourselves and our organizations from the oppressive structures that keep us from accessing the wealth that could otherwise be flowing in our organizations. So one of those tools is putting caps on extraction. Another way of saying it is just making sure that people can't take too much of the profits or too much in compensation from the organization, because that's the way that it puts a lot of pressure on organizations if you have to generate profits for an investor, and takes away a lot of the sovereignty of a group to decide how it wants to manage the wealth and the resources. So EB-Prex bylaws include examples of how we've done this, which is putting a ceiling on the return on an investment for people who buy shares. For workers, there's both, there's a floor and a ceiling in that we don't want executives to start like pulling like excessive compensation, because that happens in some cooperatives. I think the CEO of REI Cooperative makes like $3 million a year. So it's important to cap compensation, but also to ensure that there's a floor on compensation so we're not extracting from and exploiting workers. So yeah, just a few more examples. But another practice or principle is reparations, because it's like once you put a cap on the ability of, say, outsiders or insiders to extract wealth from the entity, then okay, it's like now here's the wealth that we have, where should it go? I think one of the primary things that should drive the decision about where it goes is like, where has there been harm? Where has there been theft? Where are there people who are struggling as a result of the harm, the oppressive structures, land theft, and so on? So really putting reparations, repair front and center in the organization is important. And I use the example of an octopus or the image of an octopus, because, like if an arm gets bitten off by a shark, the octopus can repair its arm. And in a way, it's like, it's just, we're repairing ourselves when we prioritize reparations in our organization, no matter who we are. It's not charity. It's just part of life that we want things around us and that are part of us to thrive and be well. A few other things to kind of help support the spread of wealth is to name the unfairness of market value. This thing called fair market value, I believe it is a cult. And it's a really creepy cult because it's really worshiping the highest bidders. The price that a home goes for, or the fair market value of a home, it's really just the amount that the highest bidder is able to pay. And why do we put so much weight on what rich people are able to come and pay to grab up our land? So a lot of groups will try, they'll purchase land and have shares of it divided among different people and guarantee those people fair market value when they want to sell their share. But it's really like the whole system has been built on unfairness. And so we really need to move away from it. And really be wary of any form of measurement or formulas, because whenever you try to measure something, you're leaving out an enormous amount of information of the immeasurable wealth that is part of it. And you just can't draw lines around things and measure what is really just like infinite and very nuanced, visible and invisible relationships with land. That like these are the things that sustain us, and you really can't measure them. Which brings up the question, though, because a lot of, like, say, real estate cooperatives or land trusts, they want there to be formulas for how do you buy in and how do you sell out, or when we have surpluses, how do we distribute it, or how do you build equity? And that is important because there's also a degree to which people need to know what their economic security is. And so giving people a basic level of security is probably very important, but still I want to encourage groups to shy away from trying to measure and create formulas for everything, because when you do that, it takes away your ability to be adaptive. Being adaptive is part of what allows you to repair if there's somebody in need or someone who's been harmed, and you have the fluidity to kind of channel resources to them. That's what really makes the group powerful. And this idea that people should somehow get an equal amount for what they give. So if you buy in at this much, you should get this exact amount back out. Why is that? Because so much of that is determined based on what privilege people have to begin with, which determines the wealth that they're able to bring. Why do we need to keep things stagnant in that way by trying to have this strict reciprocity? Another thing might just be that, it's not just about reparations and focusing on, okay, who has need? You don't want to just focus on that. Also focus on like, who has too much here? Who's accumulating so much wealth somewhat unnecessarily that could in fact be extracting from or taking away from others? So I think it's important to start, and this is kind of taboo in our culture, right? It's talking about how much money do people have, but there's almost a pathological tendency to want to accumulate infinitely. And the reason for that is because the future is infinitely uncertain. And we just always think, well, I should just build this giant nest egg to make sure that I and my children will always be okay forever in the future. But really, if you think about it, people never stop accumulating. They never get to a point where they think they're fine. And so really, like, we need to look at that and just be like, is this a good thing for us, this private accumulation? Just a few other things. So you don't think of this as building wealth, but we do build wealth by participating and seeing ourselves as part of broader movements for social transformation. And we build wealth by embedding ourselves in networks of reciprocity. And I use this image of California. The stars represent a lot of the land projects that are emerging and that we're working with. But we know it's California. A lot of them are going to burn. But by being in relationship with each other, many of them are, there's a lot of overlapping people and relationships. The relationships with each other make them resilient. So yeah, we build wealth by building out our broader networks and not just being insular to protect ourselves. And overall, I think it's about turning this dominant logic inside out. Because our dominant logic is this one of like, we need to build up fortresses around ourselves, protect ourselves, and accumulate as much as we can because the future's scary. But if we begin to see that our well-being is actually best supported by creating collective well-being, then the logic is not about getting as much as we can. It's about just letting the wealth flow as much as we can. And coming together, deciding things together, listening to each other, paying attention to where there's need and opportunity, and just letting that wealth flow. Okay, the third principle is, talking about having spoken of spreading power and spreading wealth and creating those kinds of relationships. Now, how do we protect them in the long term? How do we keep them rooted? One thing is restraints on sale, like say something in your bylaws, in the deed, wherever it may be, that just says this land is not for sale, this organization is not for sale. And it's important. And I like to use the example that almost every country bans the sale of organs, because no matter how destitute you are, you should not be pressured to sell your kidney or part of your liver just because you need to get by. But that's really what happens to the land in this organization. I mean, in this world, which is, land is like the organs of the planet. It's what allows us to live and breathe. And the organizations that we form to nurture ourselves and the land, those are the organs of our communities. So we shouldn't be able to sell them just because of economic pressures. So what's important to know is that if you're going to put restraints on the sale of assets, it's important to do so really upfront before people start to feel like they have a vested interest or asset. Because otherwise, if you try later on to put a restraint on, say, the sale of a property, it can be a little bit like trying to stuff toothpaste back up into the tube. Because once people feel like, oh, this is mine, that endowment effect sets in, and then people feel like they're giving something up. So it's better that we not have that endowment set in to begin with. And I dropped in some slides from the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative Bylaws that just share examples of how we've tried to prevent the sale of real estate and what happens. Okay, like if real estate is sold or if the cooperative closes, what happens to the assets, making sure that it goes to nonprofits or Native American tribes. And we built all this into the bylaws and also made it very hard to change. So there's certain pages of the bylaws where there's designated individuals in the community who would have to approve any change to the bylaws, because otherwise you can imagine a situation where if membership dwindles to a small group of people and they think, hey, why don't we just sell the many millions of dollars of assets and divvy it up amongst ourselves, that, that would be stealing from the community. So yeah, we try to make it very hard to change. A second tool for, helping root the wealth and power in the long term is just really thinking about the internal resilience of an organization, really thinking about what could cause it to unravel from within. And it's a lot of the stuff that I've already acknowledged, is like having robust systems for managing conflict. But yeah, just like really what's going to help this organization remain solid and connected on the inside. As compared to external resilience, what are the relationships the organization builds on the outside? So like, let's imagine East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative closes. What happens to all that land? Well, it still benefits to the community to the extent that the relationships the cooperative has ensures the land remains in the community's hands in some form. So yeah, we have external relationships in that case that help hold the cooperative accountable to broader systems change work. So there's 3 directors that are appointed by local nonprofits to keep in mind certain interests, such as Indigenous communities and Black communities. And the fourth thing is systems change work. Like, we can't just create radical real estate projects in a vacuum. When I've acknowledged, like, the law is very problematic in so many ways, and we should all be participating in changing it, because otherwise it threatens the long-term resilience of all of this. And one of the things that's essential is just preventing what is really a wave of land grabs that's been happening, that's continuing to happen, and like advocating for laws that prevent big corporations from coming and just grabbing up what's left of the land that could be in the community's hands. And so, yeah, it's tempting to think of the government as this thing other than us, or policies as things other than us, but it really is us. Like, we are entitled to work together and create the society that we live in. And so just want to encourage groups to be more active in shaping law and policy. But yeah, ultimately, I think only love can put us in right relationship to land. And this being a legal workshop, I just want to say, like, that is legal advice. Because ultimately, we have a challenging future ahead of us, and what's going to work well in the long term is it's the stuff that feels right. It's the stuff that we feel motivated to get up and do every day because it nourishes our lives and the lives around us. So that's my legal advice. Love is very important. And, small collectives, that's the heart of it. That's where so much of this work is going to get done, is in small groups of people who hold each other accountable, who motivate each other with affection and collaboration, but that those small collectives are going to be nested in larger movements, because so much of what needs to happen is a broader systems change, a coordinated systems change. So yeah, feeling very hopeful about this radical real estate world that we're creating. There's a lot left to unlearn, my friends. And so we have 3 slides of just stuff you can come and click on and watch or read. And we're going to be creating even more stuff in coming years as part of the Radical Real Estate Law School. And thank you for being part of a workshop where I just talk and talk and talk. But now I'm going to stop doing that and invite questions. I'm going to invite Dorian and Tia to maybe flag any other questions or comments that might be worth surfacing. And I think we're inviting people to put them in chat, but if it's something that you feel it's kind of too hard to put into chat, you can raise your hand.
I would say Dorian can pick from the chat first, because a lot of the questions that were asked in the survey were answered. I think.
That's great.
But I color coded the private version. Janelle, if you want to look.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I feel like some of the ones that were in the chat might have also been addressed to There's one from Catherine that says, with split title, how can protections be built for the building owner that the landowner won't sell the land from under them?
Yeah. Yeah, so imagine you live in a home that you own, but the land underneath is owned by a land trust. And let's say the land trust goes bankrupt and just sells the land on the market or at an auction or something like that. That would be very unfortunate. So yeah, one way to protect against that is in the ground lease, which is the main document that creates the relationship between the building owner and the landowner, is to give the building owner a right to potentially purchase at a specified price, or to give that building owner the ability to choose another land trust that can be the purchaser. Those are some ideas. There's probably other kinds of webs of relationship. I just picture every piece of land kind of suspended in this beautiful web of relationships that just makes sure like that speculative market never comes and gobbles it up.
Cambridge Redevelopment asks, is using an easement to limit housing costs better in some way than writing the kind of restriction on the deed as is often done?
Yeah, where's the difference there? You know, the thing with the easement, I don't know why this is, but in California, deed restrictions tend to be time limited. I'm not quite sure why that is. Yeah, I'm trying to think back now, like what were all the benefits of using the easement? And truthfully, the easement right now under current law, it's not the strongest tool because it may not run with the land. But we were with the easement, and you can click in there and see the example. We were trying to do more, which might even include things like limiting housing to a specific community, like low income artists, for example, and having a land trust be the holder of that easement and the enforcer of that could sort of put the land trust in a position of helping actively recruit people who could be potential residents in that property. The thing with the deed restriction is with all of these things, you need a party to enforce it. With deed restrictions, sometimes the city, cities use this a lot and they're in the position of enforcing it. But not all cities have the resources to pay attention to what happens to land and to step in and enforce. So yeah, with easements, you can also, you can grant them to a lot of different parties that will hopefully be in a position to enforce.
Okay, so Sav is asking, are community land trusts legally considered landlords to the people who lease from them?
Yep. I used to be very literal because East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, our client, our beloved client, technically they own land. They are a landlord, but one of their slogans is land without landlords. And so for a while I was like, but you guys know you're a landlord, right? But then I stopped being so literal because it's really about, spreading power to the community and not having it be held and commodified by a landlord. But yes, technically we live in this world where there's got to be a party on the deed. And if other parties are living there, the party on the deed is the landlord.
And Catherine is asking, where did Catherine's question go? Oh, Catherine would love ideas about minimizing the impact of property tax on long-term relationship with land.
I think this is where our role as policy advocates is really important, because right now in California, you can reduce property taxes in a few ways. One is you can be a 501c3 using the land for charitable purposes and probably get property tax exemption. Another is if you put some kind of restriction on the land that's considered a covenant that runs with the land, like a conservation easement, then the property tax assessor will assess or appraise the property at a lower amount, because now you've prevented regular development from taking place on the land. But there's so much else we could do to limit land that I think would merit reduced property tax assessment, but that doesn't exist in policy yet. And so, yeah, I think property tax policy is a major kind of frontier for us as advocates in the radical real estate space.
Sort of tied to that, Eric is asking, when the value of land doesn't increase at the fair market value rate, how can people leave/move and find a place to live?
When the value does not increase at the fair market value rate. Try to. Oh, okay. I think I understand the question. I'm going to just rephrase it. Like, let's say you have what's called a limited equity housing cooperative. This is something we have in California. I don't know how many other states have something similar, but the way it generally works is it's land is owned by a nonprofit and the members can buy in shares or leases. And let's say they spend $20,000 to buy in. The limited equity piece means that they can build equity on that, that 20,000 can become equity and then also earn a small rate of return. In California, it's capped at 10%, but usually it goes along with the consumer price index. So, but honestly, the consumer, I don't know how this works. The consumer price index and fair market value of land are sometimes way out of whack. And so what you might end up with when you leave is $20,000 plus a very small return on top of that, which may be nowhere near what you would need to, say, put a down payment on a piece of property in the fair market. And in the market, not the fair. Forget the word fair. But honestly, this really points to the broader problem or the need to advocate for policies that cap real estate prices so that the market doesn't allow for this wild speculative market to drive prices up like that. Because yeah, the reality is we don't want people to cash out of their cooperative at a market price, because that means the only people who can come in after them and buy in are people who can afford that, which is going to basically force gentrification on the community. So it's a problem that we can't necessarily solve with just one community, but it's something we need to do by banning corporations from coming in and buying up land. And yeah, putting caps on rents, caps on home prices, and so on.
Okay, so this is a good one. Crystal asks, is there an inherent tension between solidarity economy housing, example, CLTs, limited equity co-ops, that limit individual wealth creation, and reparative strategies that focus on individual wealth creation for Black folks? If so, how do we resolve it? If we can't resolve it, how do we create a world in which community wealth meets our need?
That seems like the big question, right? If I understood it right. Wait, is that in the chat? I want to read that again.
Yeah, definitely.
And where is that?
I can read
Okay.
it.
Okay, is there inherent tension? Right, okay, so yeah, it's like on one hand, we're talking about limiting individual wealth accumulation, because that, is one of the things that's driving inequity. At the same time that we're talking about reparations for communities that have been historically dispossessed, enslaved. And so how to reconcile those two things of wanting to build wealth for one community that's experienced the harm of wealth accumulation happening by others. And so I kind of feel like that is the question here that we're trying to create by creating these kind of webs of relationships where people are coming together and just committing to being attentive to, like, what is the harm that is caused and what is the need that is here, and how can we, through participation and collective decision making, make different choices about how resources in our society flow and to whom they flow. And honestly, I feel like the place that we're in now as a society with climate crisis, wealth inequality widening, racial inequality widening. Like we're on a path to things getting worse. And I think, what is it that's really gonna dislodge or sort of disrupt the momentum of the system as it is, and questioning any form of private land ownership or private wealth accumulation. It's not like we can give that up immediately. It's not safe to. We don't yet live in a world where that's going to show up and provide for people. But I think more and more, this idea that each individual needs to save all the money needed for the rest of their lives, we really need to start questioning that, because one, it's not possible for most people. And two, once we do start questioning that, it opens up the flow of resources. It allows resources to flow a lot more naturally to where they need to go. And we're not in that world yet. It requires so much more trust and so much more community building, but that's part of what we're trying to do here. But yeah, I also invite anyone, I kind of feel like some of these questions are not necessarily legal questions that law people need to answer, but they're broader systems change questions that any of us could answer. I would invite a coworker to pipe up on any of this, Dorian, for you to weigh in on that, or anyone else who wants to share thoughts in chat or raise your hand.
We can keep going down the list too, if that's, if we haven't, yeah, if others aren't looking to pipe up. So Topher has a two-pronged question here, and it has to do with TICs. I don't know if you've noticed it in the chat, Janelle.
Not yet.
But it says, my house is a TIC with 5 owners. For some owners, the share represents a significant portion of their wealth. They have a legitimate wish to pass this on to the children as a means of granting them more economic security. Could you talk about how cooperative structures could accommodate / include folks who have such an interest? Maybe a compromise could be struck that lets them pass it on, but at a capped appreciation rate that's still fairly high. I guess it does, yeah, it is similar to Crystal's question.
Do you want to share any thoughts on it, Dorian, or?
I'll let you crack at it, yeah.
Yeah. I think every individual really kind of needs to sort of assess where they're at. I think we all need to be a lot more courageous in trusting each other and taking chances. And I think, you know, race and privilege plays a huge role here, that there are some of us who, even if we don't have savings, we have so much race privilege or class privilege, educational privilege, that we're in a much better position. It's a much safer proposition for us to give up the path of wealth accumulation, because it's much more likely that others are going to show up and support us if we do. But I do feel like it's such a trap in many ways, to not only this expectation that we should all save enough money to provide for ourselves in retirement, but also the expectation of being able to provide for, you know, children. Because what we're doing is trying to predict the future in the long term. We're planning way, way out in the long term. And, you know, most societies, if you just look at sort of how indigenous communities manage resources around the world and throughout time, massive individual accumulation was never part of that. In many ways, it was sort of out of alignment with how people more naturally show up and just say, like, here's what we have, let's make sure everyone is provided for. And I think just sort of every person needs to sort of assess, how secure am I in this moment to either reduce the wealth that I'm accumulating, give up the wealth that I'm accumulating, so that others around me can be nourished now. But I will say, you know, there's one person I've spoken to, because there's sort of a movement of people, particularly white people who have wealth, who are realizing, whoa, we don't deserve this. This is not good. So many people were harmed and stolen from or enslaved in order for us to have this wealth. There's a lot of people now who are just like, I should give this up. But unfortunately, a lot of those it's white people who have enough to provide for themselves in the long term and extra, and they're giving away the extra. But there's a lot of us who I kind of feel like we need to expand that and just be a little bit bolder in realizing like, this shouldn't have been my wealth to begin with. We need to let this flow to where it needs to go. But yeah, I was talking to someone who was just saying, you know, I could either keep this house and let my children inherit it and have that be the gift that I give them when I go, or the gift I can give them is a world that is a more caring, giving, nurturing world. And I can do that by giving it to a land trust or like an indigenous led land trust, for example. And that the gift I'm giving them is creating a world where people give to each other. And I was like, that's a really beautiful attitude. I see a hand up, so that might be fun to have another voice talking. Brad.
Right.
Oh, hi. How's it going, y'all? We plan on calling y'all. We are a cooperative land trust out in Philadelphia. And we are trying to do a lot of these things, put together a lot of these different ideas that you're talking about in terms of changing how we do things. We're a 501c3, so not technically a cooperative. But we have a cooperative governance structure, et cetera.
Totally.
So just to that question, there's a lot of questions we might have for you, but there was one thing that came up previously about sort of the need for money all the time. And what we are looking to do is create a time-based sort of ecosystem that is insulated from the capitalist system, that wherein we can use our labor to create capital that we need to support and to like fend off things like taxes and fend off things like whatever costs we haven't yet integrated into our ecosystem yet. But yeah, we want to kind of like vertically integrate over time until we really don't need to go outside of the ecosystem for food, et cetera. And I guess I was just wondering about the tax implications of that kind of approach, and whether we would have to sort of think about creating enough capital to pay for the taxes of the supposed benefit that everyone would be getting in exchange for their labor as a part of the ecosystem.
I'm glad you brought this up because it made me think of something I could have shared earlier when I was talking about, I had a slide that said, you know, maybe try to shy away from measuring everything because it's kind of tempting, right? To start giving people points for every, you know, bit of work they do in a cooperative, or, you know, try to like measure everybody's contribution and come up with some sort of system that rewards everybody based on that measurement. But when you do start to measure stuff and try to imply that people should be compensated for their various contributions, then the IRS does, you know, even if dollars aren't changing hands, they pick up on that and they're like, that's income, that's taxable. And you can only use dollars to pay your income taxes. And so, but on the other hand, when something is not measured and when things are sort of flowing in a more gentle reciprocity, meaning like you do a favor for someone else does a favor for you, people are just sort of letting resources flow naturally among themselves on a more intuitive and generosity driven basis. You can't measure it. And the IRS has specifically said, you know, a bunch of people carpooling together, you know, everyone's benefiting here. You drive one day, in exchange, you're going to get driven another day. The IRS has said, we're not taxing that. I think the language they use is informal, non-bargained for, I can't remember what else. Exchange is not what the IRS wants to consider taxable income. So it all points to, even though I think it makes people kind of insecure. And this gets down to like our trust in each other, our relationships with each other. It's challenging to just sort of trust that a group and the spirit of generosity is going to provide for us. But honestly, for tax purposes, you're going to be much happier that way. It's going to be much easier to manage. It's just a little bit less like people aren't ready to kind of rely on it. So yeah, this thing about measurement and trying to create direct exchange, I think the more we can shift away from it, the better, I think. Yeah, for a lot of reasons.
Well, thank you so very much for that.
Yeah. Exciting to hear what you're doing.
You'll hear from us.
Okay, great. That's why we have the Resilient Communities Legal Cafe 3 times a month. And it is fun hearing from y'all. Dorian or Tia, do you have thoughts on what we might like to spend the last 6 or 7 minutes on?
I guess I've just been hearing so much about taxes. Hello, I'm Tia. I'm a staff attorney at the Law Center. And I wanted to remind folks who came that our last Radical Real Estate Law School event had a mock budget assembly. And I think the message I'm trying to say is, instead of being super obsessed with tax exemption, we could be obsessed with controlling our taxes instead. And so if we all could come together and bring participatory budgeting to the local, state, and federal level, then we can decide together how much money goes to housing. And in our mock budget assembly, obviously it was skewed because it was participants of the Radical Real Estate Law School event, but they voted to give a bunch of money to the Shumi land tax to fund the work of the Sequoia to Land Trust. And I'm sure in real life, if that really happened and our neighbors understood what land trusts and cooperatives and radical real estate projects are trying to do, then that would get fully funded too. I'm just going to drop in the link to that budget survey if y'all want to participate.
Yeah, thanks for that. Power to the people. Yeah, someone was saying to us earlier in another context that they view paying property taxes as their contribution to the local community. It's easier to feel that way with property taxes when they're not being spent on war. But yeah. So I think that's a good perspective to bring in.
We have a couple more questions that we can spend just the last 5 minutes on. What do you all think? Oh, and we have
Since
a
there's
hand
a
up by
hand-
Steve.
Okay.
Yeah.
From
Hi,
Steve.
Hello. Let's just speak it then. Hi, can you
Yeah.
hear me okay?
Mhm.
Super. This has been wonderful. I put my question in the chat. I don't know, but I just wanted to make sure it got asked. I am up in Washington State. I've been a longtime fan of SELC. I saw when you posted that job somewhat recently, was really excited. I felt like in my life, I wasn't right in the right place to commit to all that is needed, but continuing to be in touch with what you're working on is obviously very profound, and I love the solutions you're trying to figure out. I too am working on some things like that. I'm up in Washington State, and my question is whether there are any groups like SELC up here that I could connect with, or do I have to start my own? Brownie face, need a cartoonist first, but that's it.
I was
Thank
like,
you for taking my
Start
question.
your own. Yes, start your own.
Yeah.
Because yeah, I mean, really, we need so many more organizations out there doing this legal work. There's Reparations Law Center. I can't remember center at the end of it. Peggy Wolf in Seattle. I forget. I think we have someone else in Washington. On our website, you'll see we have a fellowship program with about 45 lawyers around the US who do similar work. Some of them are nonprofits, some in private practice, but one of our projects as a law center is to really try to spread this work throughout the legal profession, train legal professionals, but also really encourage people to start new such things. Every community needs a law center, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. all the stuff in the chat and the questions that you all sent in the form is really useful to us because we're constantly adapting our resources and how we teach this stuff. We really want to build up our resources. Even we spent a lot of time preparing for today, but even still, as I was presenting it, I'm just like, there's so much left to say, this is like, this is a semester's worth of material here or much more. And I'm going to guess that a lot of people are overwhelmed by the quantity of it. And, but again, just want to circle back to this message of, this is so much of this, and what's going to make it work is if we design it ourselves as communities coming together and just really asking, what are the relationships we want to form? How do we want to form them? And using sort of our own intuition for answering these questions, and not looking to lawyers to be like, give us the answers, or asking for like, what box should we put this in? So trust yourselves, trust your collective wisdom, trust the wisdom of groups to figure this out. That's my pep talk. Guess maybe it might also be a natural place to end, but Dorian, I want to invite you. Is there anything else you feel like sharing?
No, nothing at all. I'm just so grateful for everyone who showed up. And it really is a big tangle, and it doesn't have a clear answer. And I think this workshop more than anything showed that. But I really do just want to highlight, the importance of creating relationships that don't create an interdependence. The interdependence is already there, but that's celebrated and censor it. Aside from that, yeah, I think we're at time.
Yeah. And thanks. I see a lot of familiar names in the participant list. Hello, friends. Some I haven't talked to in a long time. Thanks for being here. Okay.